All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to Bridging the Generational Divide. I'm Julie Mather. I'm with Focal Point Business Coaching. So I wanted to introduce myself to you. I'm Julie Mather, and as I said, I'm a Focal Point Business Coach. I've been coaching people for more than 3.5 years. I am also a corporate trainer, and I support businesses and teams to help you drive profitability, performance, and productivity. And I've also spent over 25 years in management and marketing in both the public and private sectors. The objectives for a presentation today are let's take a look at that multi-generational workforce. I want to work through 3 steps to bridge the divide and give you some actionable exercises and tools that you can use and walk away with today, and also to provide some next steps for those of you who might like to take this further and learn a little bit more. From a housekeeping perspective, we are recording today's presentation. You are currently attending in muted mode, so audio only, but I welcome your questions and comments and will be asking for your feedback. And the way to do that is to use the chat window, and many of you have found that. If you want to give it a quick test, you're welcome to say hi or let me know where you're logging in from today. And also, if you're interested in following up with me at a later time, welcome to send me an email address or email question. So again, the agenda for this session is to review the multi-generational workplace and work through our process of understanding and appreciating diversity, finding common ground, and then supporting the team and the individual so that we can all be more successful. There will be Q&A throughout, and again, we'll talk about some next steps. So one of the first questions, since we're talking about multiple generations, I'm curious what generation our participants are from. This is anonymous. We don't know who's of what generation, but I'd be curious to know what sort of a breakdown we have in terms of our participants today. So hopefully you can see that poll and will give us some responses. All right, got a good response, about 90% of you. Excellent participation. So I'm curious to think where you think our breakdown will be. Let's see. Well, there you go. So we have actually a majority of Gen Xers in the audience today with some baby boomers, and we don't have too many of our younger generation present. Interesting to see, who takes advantage of this channel of communication. All right. So thank you again for sharing that information with me. So let's talk about this multi-generational workplace. And I think one of the things we have to do is understand what defines a generation. And there's sort of a more statistical definition around a group of people who are born, grow up, and begin to have children of their own in the same time period that we consider a generation. And that's often about a 30-year period, and that's sort of the dictionary.com definition, if you will. In social science, we're often looking at people that have experienced the same significant events within a given period of time. These can be things like wars, major technological changes, natural disasters, all sorts of big world events, and even some local events, recessions, terrorism, things like that. One thing to note is that there's not a clear consensus on how the generations are defined. We talked about names such as baby boomers and Gen X and millennials, but the edges of what those generations, where they stop and start, does vary quite a bit. But we'll talk about those terms and use those terms as part of this discussion today. So when we think about our different generations, what are some of those characteristics that we've heard? So our baby boomers generally came of age after or were born after World War II. There was a big boom in childbirth. This is our largest generation, often experienced the 60s in real time in terms of becoming adults at the time as well. When we look at Gen X, some of the things we associate with this generation are, latchkey kids. This was a period of a lot of higher divorce rates and a change in family dynamics, sometimes associated with being more cynical and independent. And then we have our younger generation in the workplace, our millennials, and these are these digital natives. Some of them were accused of, having helicopter parents and getting an award just for showing up. But we clearly have some different ways that we describe the generations. And I want to take a look at the trend, how the generational percentages have changed over time. So back in 1995, millennials had not yet entered the workforce. They weren't really born yet. And in 2015, you see really, while there are 5 generations currently in the workplace, really there's 3 that really dominate are millennials, Gen X, and boomers in roughly equal proportions. And then looking ahead to 2025, the projections are that we will see 4 generations in some equal participation there. One of the factors that's driving a lot of the baby boom generation to stay in the workforce is, some of the impact of the recession and just simply the economic need to continue working, but also longer lifespans and being healthier and wanting to be engaged and productive for a longer period of time. So we're looking at a working population of 18 to 70 years here. But I also wanted to share with you that there have been some other major changes in our workplace over the last 50, 60 years. If you go back to 1950, the majority of the workplace, if we're looking at men and women, was men, 70% men. Now, around the turn of the century in the early 2000s, this has really shifted, and we've got more of about a 52% men and 48% women breakdown in the workforce. And that's really continued through the early part of the 21st century and is projected to continue. Another shift that's happened is we have a much more diverse workforce than we used to, and this is looking at US data through immigration and just expansion of different groups within our country, and we see that it's becoming much more diverse, and in fact the millennials are said to be the most diverse generation yet. So diversity and shifts are also a big factor. So we've been talking about sort of, age and gender and workplace diversity, but I'd like you to take a moment and think about what causes conflict in your organization. When you're thinking about the issues and challenges you're facing, what are employees and the leaders in your organizations maybe complaining about most? Right? What are the areas of conflict that you experience most, and what is that common source? So I'd like to ask you to enter in the chat window, what are the things that are maybe driving some divisiveness and wedges for you in your workplace? And I'll give you a few minutes to provide some answers. All right, we have some thoughts around misunderstandings, different communication methods, choice of communication mode. All right, those are some great ideas around what we're experiencing. And certainly, communication has changed dramatically, probably in the last 10 to 15 years, much more options and ways that people are used to communicating. So I wanted to share with you a study from a group from Workfront, and they've been looking at some of the conflict in the workplace among other attributes over the last few years. And what's a little bit disturbing is that workplace conflict is actually at an all-time high, with 95% of workers experiencing conflict with other departments and groups or team. And what they then looked at is, what are the sources of conflict? So I think interestingly, a couple of you mentioned this lack of communication being a biggie, and also conflicting priorities or lack of understanding about priorities. And I would say that part of that is really a leadership issue. With people, workers don't know what the priorities for the company, and they don't really understand them. That is a real area of conflict. And things around personal or cultural differences, some of these generational differences, fighting over resources are actually a smaller percentage of what causes conflict. So in fact, some of the generational differences might be overstated and are perhaps not the main source of conflict in the workplace. And I wanted to share an article from Frank Giancola on human resource planning. And he reviewed multiple published studies and articles that were written about the generational differences and really found that the generation gap is probably more of a myth than the reality. And some of the reasons for this are something I alluded to earlier, is that we don't have a clear agreement on what defines generations, the starting and ending of birth periods for different generations. Also, generational concepts tend to oversimplify groups of people. They don't take into account differences of race, socioeconomic class, gender, also urban versus rural, how different groups experience these big life and world events or country events varies tremendously. And a generational label can oversimplify what people have experienced and tends to be too simple to really look into what are the issues. And he also found that these intergenerational conflicts that we talk about are not verified by valid research. It seems to be quite fun to talk about generational differences, and it's very popular in the media, but there's very few studies that actually really focus in on the differences. And it appears that these differences may be a bit exaggerated. And what they actually found is that the factors that motivate employers are much more similar across all three generations than we are different. So from some of the conflict choices you made, communication was a big part of that. I think this idea of understanding priorities also is communication and leadership. These are probably the bigger drivers of divisiveness. So let's talk about how we can understand and appreciate diversity in the workplace. And I would say it's not just about generational diversity. It is about cultural and experiential differences. So part of what we want to do is we want to understand each other better. And this really begins with self-awareness. Once we understand ourselves, it's really where we have to begin. And then it's important to share the different perspectives that different people have in your organization. And also discuss the impact of negative stereotypes. When we label people by generation or culture or gender, it often has a very negative impact. And most of us don't want to be labeled. We want to be looked at as individuals and whole people. And there might be some things that are true, but stereotyping is often much more negative and much more divisive. And we need to recognize that diversity in our teams actually makes us stronger. So let's take a look at self-awareness and where do we start? And it's important that we look at ourselves, both as individuals and organizations. And my question to you would be, how well do you understand the makeup of your current workforce? One of the most important things that we can do in terms of a strategic exercise is to do a SWOT analysis on ourselves. Look at our organization, the employees, and the leaders, and do a SWOT analysis. And many of you are probably familiar with this acronym. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you need to take a close look at your organization and what are your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats as it relates to the leaders and employees in your organization. One of the studies that was done recently found that one of the big weaknesses that many organizations have is what's called the leadership gap. And this is where the majority of leaders are actually in our older generations, and organizations are feeling an urgent need to accelerate the development of their leaders, with many of them reporting that 20% or more of their employees will be retiring in the next 5 years. And there's a sense that the high potential people in their organization are not ready to meet future business needs. So when you do this self-introspective and you do a SWOT analysis, you can uncover where your gaps are. And it's a great exercise, and it's important that you recognize what are your strengths and what are the opportunities that you have and that you can take advantage of, but also to identify those gaps and create plans for mitigating weaknesses. Depending on where your business is moving, you have to ask yourself if you have the right team members and experience to deal with the future of your business and what your strategy is. And you need to assess the people part of that component. One of the next steps we can use to understanding diversity is an exercise called the power of perspective. And this is actually a exercise that came out of the MetLife Mature Market Institute, and it was about building intergenerational bridges, if you will. But I think it has a lot broader applicability, because what we find is that conflicts in the workplace often arise due to differences in perspectives of how things should be done. And this can vary within departments, between departments, different locations. People have a tendency of thinking about how things should be done based on the ways that they've done them. And the goal of this exercise is to reduce this conflict by encouraging employees to recognize, value, and respect the perspectives of one another, but also to do it in the context of the organization and how it has changed over time. So the way that this works is the first thing you do is you create a company timeline from the first year of operation to your present day. And then what you want to do, and you would do this in a smaller group, is have all of your employees in this exercise mark on the timeline when they started work at the company. And then you want to think about the timeline in terms of the specific topic that's causing tension. Is it technology? Is it rewards and recognition benefits? Whatever the source of conflict is, you want to consider that in the context of the path that the company has taken over time. And you want to have your employees indicate on the timeline when particular milestones or changes occurred. And what were the impact? Was it a positive improvement? Or were there problems associated with changes? What were those? And map those out, because this can really help people understand at all levels what the company has gone through and why sometimes we do things the way we do. And here's an example of what that might look like. So this is a timeline that is looking at the impact of changes in the range of benefits that employees had. So they got the whole company history there. They've mapped the key milestones of how changes happened and where different employees entered the organization at that time. So this is one thing that might look like. And it's a great way to take a step back and look at the evolution of the company and understand the perspective of people that maybe were hired earlier and were used to a certain sort of benefit and how that's changed now, and that can cause some tension for people. And then the other question I always like to ask, and it's a great little acronym called QUINK, which isn't that easy to say, but it really kind of dives into that idea of hindsight. Knowing what I now know, what would I do differently? We can often become tied to different ways of doing things because they've always been done a certain way. But hindsight is really, 20/20, as we say. And the question would be, if you were starting from scratch today with all the experience that you've got, would you do it differently? Would you do it at all? I worked in a company for over a decade, and we would always do a certain type of monthly sales report. And the question was that process to generate that data useful? Was the organization making decisions based on that data? So there's nothing like a little bit of hindsight to really help you look at why you do things the way you do and think about, is this a useful exercise still, or how might I tweak it? In this way, you can share perspectives across your organization, deepen understanding of each other, but also think about how might we do this differently? How do we come together to improve this? So I'm curious to know, you've been listening to me drone on here for a few slides. What are some of the ways that you've used in your organizations to bring people together, get people to share their perspectives? Have you had any success with particular methodologies or exercise? And if you do, please just enter those into the chat window. All right, I've got one person that's been using a roundtable at the end of the unit meetings. So probably sharing what went well, what didn't, what might you change, having an open discussion about whatever it is that was presented at a meeting. I've got somebody that's a recent hire and has been doing one-to-one meetings with various questions. So going out and putting yourself out there and learning from others, right? Learn about people's expectations and experience. That's a great way to understand people's perspectives. Okay, well, thank you for your insights and sharing those ideas with us. So, sometimes it can seem easier to blame our problems on our differences and use these as excuses, but I think most of you would agree that this generally has a negative impact and can reduce morale and productivity. So what's much more useful and productive is for us to build on what we have in common What are the shared values? And most of us have a desire for our companies to succeed. So what do we have in common? How do we go about finding common ground? So I think first we need to recognize that by and large, employees really do want the same things, and we'll be talking about those more in the next few slides. I also want to share some exercises with you on how we can demonstrate the similarities that we do have. And also, it's important to reinforce company vision, values, and culture, and also priorities. And this is really a leadership function, but one thing that all employees have in common is the company they work for. So finding common ground around these sorts of issues is a great way to build on what we have in common versus what divides us. So this is a report out of the UNC Keenan Flagler Business School, and they looked at the three main generations in the workplace today, and they surveyed 5,400 employees. And between the baby boomers, the Gen X, and millennials, they found that they really have a lot more in common than you might expect. And people across the board want to work on challenging projects. They want to have competitive compensation. They want opportunities to learn and grow and advance in their career. They want to be treated fairly. And they're also looking for work-life balance. Now, it can be different, how each generation or individual interprets some of these things in terms of how they learn or what work-life balance means to them. But by and large, these overarching themes are things that people and employees are looking for. They also asked employees what they want from their leaders. And they're looking for leaders who lead by example and are accessible, and to help others see how their roles contribute to the organization, and leaders that act as coaches and mentor, and also challenge others and holds others accountable. And I think that goes back to that fairness question. We're looking for fairness in how people are treated and expectations, and that people are held accountable. And an additional study that was reported in this report from UNC was that there's sort of 4 universal needs that employees have, and it follows on from the previous 2 slides. This need to be respected and to feel valued for the knowledge and skills and experience that we have. People also want to feel connected. They do want to collaborate and work together with each other to solve problems, but kind of on the opposite end, they also want autonomy. If we've stated some goals and targets that we have that we're working toward, they like some autonomy to figure out how to do that and to successfully navigate to that shared goal using their own self-control. So these are these 4 universal needs that employees have. And this is across generations, so recognize that we have a lot in common with each other. We sometimes go about things differently, but ultimately there's a lot of common ground. One of the tools that I use with all of my clients, and often as a way to build teams, is what's known as DISC, or a DISC behavioral assessment. Some of you might be familiar with that, and the DISC stands for the 4 human behavioral styles that we have. It's dominance, influence, compliance, and steadiness. And what's great about DISC is, number one, it's a wonderful tool for learning self-awareness, but the styles are actually universal. This is a great way to look at your employee base in a different lens. It does break it into 4 groups, but what we find is that styles are universal. They're not correlated to your age, your gender, your ethnicity. This is a tool that is used globally. And what you'll find is if you do a DISC report and you look at your team, you're going to find commonalities across generations, across genders, and different ethnic groups. So it's a great way to have self-awareness, but also appreciate, oh, this person's actually like me. And when we understand the different behavioral styles, we can also improve communication, because each style has different preferences for how they communicate. So whenever we can recognize different styles, we can be more effective in our communication. And as we talked about earlier, communication is one of those challenging things that is a breakdown that often causes conflicts. So another exercise I wanted to share with you is sort of a group exercise on learning what's in common. And here it's more about sort of personal histories and preferences. And let's find out what's in common. And you can ask questions about things like your place of birth, how many siblings you had, what's your favorite mode of transportation to work, maybe a key skill that you want to learn, a favorite hobby, even your DISC style. And you can do a group exercise in a couple of different ways. You could have a sheet with all the questions, and you answer the questions for yourself, and then you network around the room and find people that have things in common with you, and you start to get to know people, and whoever finds the most common interest wins, or something like that. Or you can do a group lineup where people, you'll make a statement, who was born in San Francisco or California or what have you, have everybody step forward, and that way people can see each other. Oh, look at all these different people that I have something in common with. So this is a way to take away some of those maybe charged kind of topics and find common ground between each other. So again, I'd like to hear from you. Are there ways and tactics that you've used to find common ground, to get people talking and sharing what they do have in common? If any of you have any insights that you would like to share, I'd be very interested to hear that. All right, so finding some commonalities around hobbies and interests, going out to lunch, right? Taking a step away from sometimes the structure of meetings or departments and get to know each other a little bit more on a social level. And you're bound to find some commonalities in that way. Great, thank you for sharing. All right, so the next piece I want to go through in terms of this process of building bridges between our teams is that we have to support both the team and the individual. And one of the best ways that we can support our teams and share knowledge and perspectives is to find ways to learn from each other. So as much as possible, you want to create work teams that have diversity, and that can be diverse experience, knowledge, and perspectives. It can be, having a variety of ages and genders and cultures in your teams so that you can really use that diversity as an asset to find unique ways of identifying opportunities and solving problems that you only get when you have a diverse group of people with different perspectives and experience to really contribute. For any of you that might be working with offices that are international, or maybe you have suppliers or key partners that are in other countries, you can develop cross-cultural skills for your teams by providing global learning experiences. You may have a project and you might have employees work at a different job site for a period of time, or maybe work virtually, but provide opportunities where people that are working globally can come together and work toward some common project or problem solving. And then a third way that you can really share knowledge and learn from each other is to create employee affinity or mastermind groups. Now, if you think about some sort of knowledge that you want to develop across your organization, maybe it's something around customer research or customer service. Do you have champions in brand loyalty or something like Six Sigma? What are some of the core competencies that your organization is using? And get people together to share best practices, and also allow maybe some of your younger team members to ask questions, or they might propose ways of doing something that you hadn't thought about. So creating an opportunity to build the competencies around some key pillars in your organization in an informal way, in sort of a mastermind group. Now, we talked about earlier that employees are looking for opportunities to grow and learn, and they want to be more successful and move up in the organization. And mentoring and coaching programs are a great way to encourage both cross-generational communication, but also to enhance career satisfaction. One of the main programs that we use at Focal Point is called Navigational Conversation, and this is helping leaders learn coaching skills. Oftentimes as leaders, as we've moved up into management roles, we are sometimes so comfortable with problem solving that we tend to spend all of our time doing that instead of managing. And this is a way to develop the problem solving capacity of your employees, and also to learn how to give effective feedback, and that includes active listening skills. So this is a program that we offer to help teach leaders to be coaches. And then there's mentoring, and many organizations are doing mentoring. This can be formal or informal. It can be short-term or longer term. It can be situational, maybe for a specific thing that somebody wants to learn. And that's often where something like reverse mentoring comes in. And this is a great way where the more junior employee is teaching a longer tenured employee something. And certainly when we're looking at our millennials and our older generations, maybe a millennial employee is mentoring a more senior employee in the use of social media or some other tool that they're very comfortable with. And it's a great way to allow that millennial to learn some teaching and mentoring skills. But generally, what happens when you have a mentoring relationship is you're building that relationship between two people, and that younger employee is also interested to know from that more senior leader, what are some organizational knowledge that they can impart? What can they can learn from them? So mentoring is also another great way that we can learn from each other. So we're looking to support the team and individual. Communication skills are so important. I've talked a little bit about the DISC program and understanding ourselves and how to communicate more effectively with others, building your active listening skills. We also have a program called Personal Effectiveness, and whether you're a leader or simply an employee in an organization, we're generally needing to communicate and influence others. And so we have a program called Personal Effective that focuses on that. And for leaders, it's really important to communicate the culture, the vision, and the goals and priorities for your organization. So another thing that's happening in many places is to offer flexible options for workers. The workplace is diverse and complex, and if we reframe some of our generational differences, maybe in terms of employee life stages, we recognize that there are different needs depending on where you are in your life or career stage. So how can we provide different options that will meet employees where they are? And when we do this, we can increase the job satisfaction for everybody. For example, some of those newer employees that are just out of college, they might be in some huge burden of college student loan debt. So is there some sort of loan matching program that might be an option? Your middle stage employees may have children. They might be saving for college. They might be looking for some opportunities to make some extra cash. Are there some bonus programs or things, incentives that would work better for them? For some of your later stage employees. Maybe some people are looking to move toward retirement, and what they want to do is back out a little bit. Is something like part-time work an option? And when you're looking at recognition programs, there's things that we do informally around maybe happy hours or bringing in pizzas or lunch that doesn't necessarily work for everybody if you do it one way all the time. So how can you be flexible? If after hours is a conflict for people who have to go pick up their kids from childcare or other responsibilities, then it's not really helpful to everybody in the organization. So being flexible and looking at what are the needs of your employees and tailoring your incentives and benefits and compensation programs to meet employees where they're at is a great way to support them as individuals and just increase job satisfaction for all of the people in your workforce. And one way to do that, many employers will do some sort of annual survey, and it might be around company vision and values and goals, but add in things around what are their needs, what are they looking for with respect to incentives or rewards. Flexible work hours work for many employees. If you're time constrained because you have to take kids to school or doctor's appointments, or you're just somebody who likes to work at night, maybe you want to be able to work from home. Different things work for different people. So recognizing that individuals do have different needs is also a way to help everybody. So in conclusion, I hope you understand or get that intergenerational differences are not necessarily the biggest cause of conflict that we have. There are often more structural and systemic challenges around leadership and communication that tend to be much more divisive. And you want to focus on shared values, find common ground, and work in a positive way to build bridges between employees and support the team and the individual moving forward. We do need to meet employees where they're at and help them to be successful. Some of the services that we offer for companies that we work with, we do one-to-one coaching with business owners and executives, corporate training programs around things like DISC and the Navigational Conversations program, and also small group sessions where we are working with a small cohort over multiple sessions, things like personal effectiveness or facilitated masterminds. These are some of the ways that we support companies and organizations. So I'd be interested to know which of these topics interests you most. We've covered a few different ideas, and I'm curious where your challenges are and would like to know which of these areas is most interest to you. Give you a couple more moments to respond. All right. So, what we see is a pretty equal split between improving communication, coaching and mentoring, and leadership development. Great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to open up the floor. We have some time before the hour and see if you had any specific questions that you would like me to address before we close out our session today. Or if you'd like to share what's been most useful for you today, what's maybe one takeaway that you've got from our session today that you hadn't thought of before? Any of those would be fantastic. Please go ahead and just enter them in the chat window. All right. So one of you is mentioning that there's the importance of leaders functioning as coaches. Yeah, I think there's a real trend for this in leadership, is that a coaching skill where you help people find their own answers is so powerful because rather than telling people what to do, they come to their own answers and conclusions on their own. And coaching people to be successful really helps to develop them. The notion of focusing on the positives and what we have in common versus what divides us, right? Being positive and understanding that there is diversity, but it's a positive, and how do we build on what we can do together, what we share as values, and what we want to accomplish as an organization. And leadership, right? So much of I think the miscommunication and missteps are a lack of good communication. And there's no doubt that technology has changed communication in the workplace. And we have to perhaps rethink the way we've always done things. If you've always done it through a face-to-face town hall setting, is that the most effective way to get the message out? We do have to adapt to the changes in the business, and it's not simply about millennials. It's that business is changing rapidly. Technology is such a front and center piece of how we interact today, so it's important to recognize that and make some changes. Thank you so much for some of your feedback. The other thing I'd like to do is, in appreciation for your attending this live session today, I'd like to offer those of you that have joined me a complimentary 30-minute coaching session. And I'd love to hear what your concerns are at your organization and help you map out what you might do next. What are your next steps in terms of solving some of the issues that you have? I put this Calendly link into the chat. You can simply click on that and click through to my calendar and set a time, and it's a complimentary session. And in fact, the first 5 of you that take advantage of this, I will extend that to a 60-minute session. So I would love for you to take advantage of this offer, get to know you, and see how I can support you to be more effective in your organization. Some people might be interested in learning more about some of the training programs that we have, or you might have an issue. It depends on where you are in your organization and your career, what's of interest to you. Be happy to spend some time working through that with you. Yeah, one of the questions that's come in is about the teacher and mentor and the importance of face-to-face communication for important issues. I think that does seem to be a skill that our newer generation necessarily doesn't use, or that mode of communication. But I think that if you start working on communication and we understand how much of communication is actually given through body language and nonverbal communication, it's a great way to start helping people recognize and see the value of face-to-face communication. All right, well, we are going to close out this session. Again, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you joining me. And again, if you have any questions, you can follow up with me via email, and I would be happy to speak to those of you that will take advantage of a complimentary coaching session so we can address some of the issues that brought you to this session today.